Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have two very special guests back on the podcast. This is actually the first time they've been on together, but they have each been on separately. Josh, I think you've been on at least two or three times now. Jake, this will be your second time. But if you aren't familiar with them, we have Josh Pelland. Then we also have Jake Remmert. They're both from Data Driven Strength, and we are going to chat about the meta-regression that the preprint of the meta-regression they had on volume today. So looking forward to chatting with you guys. And again, appreciate you guys both taking time out of your day to chat. I know you guys are both busy. Jake, you're in the middle of prep right now. Already did a show. Josh, you just got back from traveling. And like you said, you are irresponsible with saying yes to many things, keeping you busy. So again, appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to hop on here. Real quick, I guess, Jake, we'll start with you real quick, man. Anything that's been going on in your end lately?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having us and for having me back. I didn't completely ruin my relationship with you, I guess, the first time. So thanks, dude. It's an honor as always. For me, yeah, I mean, we got the lab is always busy, right? So as people, we're going to talk about the meta today, but as some people are at least are aware, we do have another one coming hot on its heels here. Very similar type of analysis, but on per session volume rather than total weekly volume. So working hard on that, trying to get it buttoned up. Otherwise, data collection for my dissertation, keeping me busy. Data collection for the case study for my prep, keeping me busy. So there's a lot of really cool research stuff on the horizon that I'm very excited about. And then obviously just the prep itself is a full-time job at this point. So is what it is, but it's been a blast. It's been great. I did my first show ever here this past weekend on 11/9 was the date. So super fun, awesome experience. Loved every minute of it. And got another show on the 23rd, and then we finally get to eat some food and return to being as much of a normal human being as I ever am, I suppose. But
right in time for Thanksgiving too.
Dude, that my post-show meal is going to be home cooked Thanksgiving dinner from my parents, so it'll be amazing.
When I did my first show, this was like 7 years ago. Man, it's been a long time. I remember it was around this time period, and it was like, man, the Thanksgiving that year was glorious.
Dude, I get two Thanksgivings, right? Because it's a hometown show that I'm doing, so I get that Thanksgiving is kind of early, and then we'll come back here and do another one. So I cannot wait, man. But at the same time, it's very important to me to control the recovery portion of this whole thing as well as I can. And obviously, I need to gain some weight to be healthy. But with my frame, my height, my muscle mass, et cetera, like I don't need to be 210 pounds, So if I can stay a little bit leaner in the off season, that's definitely a big goal, and setting myself up for that by not blowing up like a whale right after the show is important. So we'll do our best.
Well, this will be the first time you'll kind of experience that, like kind of post, because from my understanding, this was okay.
Yeah, I attempted a contest prep back in 2020 and was 5 weeks out when the world shut down. So I was close, but not quite as lean as I am now. And the rebound from that was it was a task, right? And that was my first time ever being that lean, so it was certainly challenging. And I think this time there are some strategies that I will employ to be a bit more successful with handling all that stuff. So at least I have one under my belt that was almost the same thing. And so I think this time will go much smoother, but that's the hope anyway.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you definitely, after, when you get that lean, it's, really challenging to, everything just tastes so freaking good. And it's just, you have to be on top of it for sure. And like you said, have some strategies in place to help you manage that caloric intake following it. And Thanksgiving definitely doesn't help after, but like I said, it'll be awesome for you. So cool, man. And Josh, how about you? How have things been going on your end?
I largely echo Jake, multiple things, multiple projects at various stages. That's kind of the game you play, is you're like, all right, we got, a couple things close to the finish line, but you also have to be paying your dues in terms of the projects that might not see the light of day for another year or two. And then you have some projects where it's like, yeah, we got the data collected. You got to somehow find time to analyze that data, write it up. So it's just kind of a balancing act on that front. So Jake and I are very much in the same boat there. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap in the projects we're working on. But I can confirm Jake is very, very lean right now. I think you might have just mentioned this, Jake, but a project that Jake has spearheaded is because it's himself is the case study on his prep, which I think will be really cool data. I think the methods there are going to be the best that anyone's done with a bodybuilding case study. And I can say that because I've been loosely involved, if at all. So that'll be cool. But yeah, man, I don't basically similar stuff going on as Jake, but I'm just holding a lot more body fat. So that's what I have going for me right now.
Yeah, same thing, just at a little bit more body fat. I love it. Jake, as far as the case study goes, is there anything specific that you're kind of trying to get data on and stuff like that?
Everything. So this, I say this as humbly as possible. This will be by far the most comprehensive case study that we have. We're doing, dude, I'm so tired of getting my blood drawn, but basically what we're doing, I had at baseline before I started dieting at all, and then through the entire prep period, which is going to wind up being 30 weeks, I think, and then the entire recovery period until I restore baseline values, right? So massive time frame. It'll likely be a year. That we're going to have every 2 weeks, we're doing blood draws for testosterone, leptin, and thyroid hormone. We're doing resting metabolic rate, resting heart rate, blood pressure, energy expenditure in a set like treadmill walking task, performance testing on 3 different exercises, muscle thickness at 3 different sites, skin fold thicknesses at 8 sites, ultrasound fat thickness measurements at those same 8 sites. Am I missing anything? I think that's it. So that's every 2 weeks, the entire time. Every week, I'm doing, I think it's 4 different psychological questionnaires. So it's motivation to train, perceived recovery, various eating behavior things, and the other one is body image. And then every 4 weeks, I'm also doing perceived stress and sleep quality. So I have all that stuff. It's either week or 4 weeks. I have my daily macronutrient intakes, calorie intake every single day, all my training data that's, sets, reps, load, RIR, pump, all that stuff every session. I have step counts from every day. I have every 4 to 8 weeks, we're doing a qualitative interview. So we'll have all that stuff to kind of fill in the gaps. I think that's it. It's enough, I think. So it's a lot, and I don't even want to think about all the analysis I'm going to have to do, but we're going to have all the data. So that's exciting. And I mean, you can do endless kind of analyses on that stuff, right? So yeah, I'm super excited for it. And we got a cool team kind of assembled to analyze, and that helped us plan it, analyze it, be able to put it out there and talk about it. And yeah, it'll be great. I'm super stoked. It's just one extra, not even one, it's 100 extra things to be doing during the prep, but it's all good. It'll be worth it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, good for you, man, to be doing all that during prep. And again, you're kind of probably not at your full capacity from a brain standpoint right now either. So keeping track of all that stuff. And Josh, you said you're kind of keeping an eye on it as well too.
Yeah, I just get to, Jake's talking about all this data. I mean, might put up a paywall for the various images and videos that you could get given, his current attractiveness. I just get all that for
yeah.
I just get all that for free. So
yeah.
that's my involvement.
There you go. Yeah, we're getting photos too. I forgot about that. Every couple of weeks we got standardized photos, everything, dude. Yeah, that'll be cool though.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, super cool. Because I mean, that stuff's probably really hard to get, from a research standpoint, just because, again, I mean, it's hard to get that, hard to get people to do that. So, cool. Yeah, you guys are busy, keeping us, anyone who's interested in the research on, anything muscle building, strength, you guys are keeping us busy reading that stuff, and you guys are even busier doing it all. So really appreciate your work. And I think the per session volume, I think, will be super cool too, because that's one that I feel like is, volume in general is one that a lot of people there's a lot of back and forth. I'm sure this is partly why you guys wanted to do this, but not only is it weekly, but then even within the session too, that's a big question. So really looking forward to that. Do you guys have like kind of a time frame when you think that is done? I know that obviously it's going to be very dependent on many different things, but is there kind of an idea when you think that will be done?
It should be super soon, to be honest. It's
Cool.
just in the very latter stages of writing the paper up. So should be soon.
Awesome. Cool. Looking forward to that. Well, let's talk about the meta-regression that you guys had that's in preprint. At least I believe it still is in preprint. I know that takes some time there. But you guys also did, well, Josh and Zach, I know you guys did a preprint. And Jake, were you on that paper too? The training intensity one?
Yeah.
You were on that. Cool. Yeah, you guys do a great job with these meta-regressions, and I think they're awesome. And so you guys did one titled "The Resistance Training Dose Response: Meta-regressions Exploring the Effects of Weekly Volume and Frequency on Hypertrophy and Strength Gain." So really, to start this off, I mean, why did you guys want to look into this? And then maybe if we can kind of hit on going into it, kind of what the state of the literature was on volume.
Yeah, I can kick it off if that's cool. Yeah. So I think you kind of mentioned obviously the meta-regressions that we're talking about right now on volume and frequency that we recently pre-printed, and then the ones on repetitions and reserve for hypertrophy and strength outcomes that Zach spearheaded. Those are just kind of our perspective of how to best look at these kind of fundamental training questions, because typically what's done is you might on the front end say, hey, is less than 5 sets or more than 5 sets, does that tend to be better in the available data? Or is non-failure versus failure training, is that which of those is better, or are the outcomes typically pretty similar? Whereas we kind of took a step back, and huge credit to Zach here, because he really kind of spearheaded our lab in improving our statistical approach to a lot of things, and just saying like there could be important insights here that are not gained from a categorical approach. So, for example, going like up until Zach published the RAR meta-regressions, I think a lot of people in the evidence-based sphere would say that training to failure doesn't really seem to confer a massive benefit for hypertrophy. As long as you are training within a reasonable proximity to failure, you're going to get similar results. And I think that was a good interpretation of the analyses we had at the time. But instead, we wanted to say, hey, what is the general nature of this dose response here? So as you go from 5 RAR to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to 0 RAR, and then all the way to what we coded as a -1 RAR in that paper, which is actual momentary failure. What is the nature of that dose response relationship? Do you get more and more hypertrophy as you get closer to failure, and then maybe around 2 or 3 RAR, it completely plateaus? Or do you continue to see that general direction, that general upward trend all the way to failure? So same idea with volume, right? We've had plenty of meta-analyses in the past on volume, very, very well done meta-analyses. I would even go so far as to say as like key papers in our field, very well cited, very, very important papers. But with the benefit of being in 2024/2023 when we did this project, we had a lot more data. And again, we kind of had Zach's project, that continuous sort of analysis and the methods there. Let's look at that for volume, right? And we kind of took the opposite approach of saying, hey, on the front end, instead of determining a cutoff point of say 5 sets or 10 sets or 20 sets, and then kind of dichotomizing our results, hey, which is better, less than 5 sets or more than 5 sets, less than 10 sets or more than 10 sets? Instead, what we said is, what's the best way to characterize the nature of the continuous dose response relationship? And then let's try to describe that on the back end. So you're kind of making those quote unquote categories, or making those claims on the back end once you say, hey, this is the best way to describe the underlying data. So that's really the fundamental thinking behind the project. And part of the reason we wanted to get those sorts of insights is because the pendulum has kind of swung, right? People have probably heard claims like 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, or I should just say recommendations of say 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. Some might say that that is overkill. Some might say that at some point you're going to basically induce way too much muscle damage to the point where you actually see worse gains. So I want to say, hey, do we have evidence for these sorts of claims? And in our view, this is our best shot at getting some insight to those sorts of claims. because studies differ in their findings for a lot of different reasons. So we want to say, hey, when we put it all together, what is the general directionality and what's our best guess for the nature of this dose response relationship based on what we have as of 2023/2024.
Yeah, because I know with like the RAR training, again, it was like, again, it just kind of showed you, hey, ideally you want to, the closer you get to failure, the better the hypertrophy results are going to be. But it didn't necessarily say, hey, do, this this rep and reserve, like there isn't the perfect one. It's just, hey, as you got closer to it, that was generally better for muscle growth, from my understanding, right? And so it's kind of the same thing here. I feel like with the volume, I think it's less like, again, it's less exact numbers, but more so like generally, where's, if you go to this point, where does it trend there with that? So I think that's awesome. And I think you guys do a great job here with these meta regressions. Jake, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing, and Josh kind of mentioned this, but just to also, I don't know, highlight it a little bit, is just the fact that we have the advantage of it's now, been whatever, 6 or 7 years since the Schoenfeld meta came out 2017, or published anyway in 2017. And so there's just more data, and particularly there's more data with higher volumes that have been done in recent years that just weren't able to be included in those earlier analyses, right? So that's nice to sort of update our understanding by including that data in there. And I think the other advantage to how the analysis was done is that we can get some pretty good insights into not just the direction and magnitude of the relationship, but also the uncertainty. And so like something that, we've tried to emphasize when in the paper, and then also in talking about it, is that like, yes, we see this relationship where in general, more volume led to greater hypertrophy or what have you, but the uncertainty also grows with those higher volumes. So it's important to, not get too carried away with, having really, really strong, really confident conclusions of like, yeah, more is better. But just the ability to estimate and describe that level of certainty of the evidence was also an important thing, and an important learning process we got from Zach's project, and really, as Josh said, diving really deep into how to do that kind of analysis, and just seemed very helpful and really appropriate, right? So yeah, that's all I had.
What did you guys kind of think was going to happen, like before you guys started this? Did you guys have any thoughts in terms of what the results were going to be?
I guess I'll go quick. Like my hypothesis going in was more volume was going to be better, with diminishing returns. So like not necessarily a linear relationship. And then my gut feeling, just based on just experience, training, coaching, etc., was that there was probably going to be a relatively hard tapering off of the outcomes as volume got higher and higher. That was kind of my guess, which I guess I wasn't too far off. But certainly the plateau towards the end or towards the higher volume values that I was expecting, like it's just not quite as much as I was expecting. But again, the uncertainty around there, like, hard to make a confident thought, but that was my thought going in.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar on that front. I think I expected a stronger plateau in the dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy. I'm assuming that's kind of what we're gonna focus in on here, is that outcome specifically. I think relatively early on in extracting, I probably would have even hypothesized the start of the inverted U. So just so the listeners on the same page, the inverted U is basically the idea that, okay, you see, a pretty strong effect of additional volume on muscle growth, but then eventually those returns diminish. So for every additional set you do, you get less and less hypertrophy, to a point where it actually plateaus. But then there's a point beyond that where additional sets lead to less hypertrophy. I think I probably would have hypothesized that. I can't remember exactly where my head was at, because things kind of change. Your thinking kind of changes, and even though we're quite aware of things like recency bias when you're reading studies and then thinking about an entire body of literature, we still fall prey to it, right? We're not free of those sorts of psychological fallacies, if you will. But yeah, I think the dose response is stronger than I anticipated, and I think Jake shares that perspective. But there's a lot to discuss from a technical perspective, we'll probably skip over that for the purposes of this for this show. But from a technical perspective, from an uncertainty perspective, and just from a understanding that there's a lot of unknowns here, even thinking about like the way that we measure muscle in the first place, and what is the context of these studies. Basically the way that I would think about these studies for the listener or for a reader of our paper is, hey, Jeff, if you're a participant in our study, you have 10 and a half weeks, which was the average duration of the studies in the meta-analysis. You have 10 and a half weeks to increase the muscle thickness of, say, your biceps or your quads. Increase that muscle thickness as much as possible over the next 10 and a half weeks, right? That's a much different question than saying, hey, Jeff, you have a family, you have responsibilities, and there's a lot of other things you probably get out of training and other things you have going on that maybe the average participant in the included studies did not have going on. And you also probably want to do this for decades, right? Those are fundamentally different questions. And I think that is kind of, that is a key point for interpretation and application of the findings. And I think that leads to an interesting discussion of like, what is research actually for? Those common recommendations of 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. Is that really the role of research, or is that something that, sure, if Jeff says that to his clients, that's fantastic because he has to kind of chew the food for them and provide very tangible things for someone that just wants to kind of be told what to do. But as a science communicator, especially as the scientists themselves doing the project, is that really the job of the scientist, is to make those sorts of practical recommendations, given you have no idea about the values, the lifestyle, the constraints of the folks that are going to apply those things? That's where I think things get quite interesting in terms of interpretation and application.
So kind of what you're saying, at least how I hear it, is like basically in these, the meta-analysis, the studies that you guys use for this meta-regression, the goal of a lot of them is just to see how much muscle they can grow in like a certain amount of time, right? And that isn't necessarily practical to most people in real life, right? Is that kind of what you are saying there with that?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there's a few things to consider here. So there's probably some degree of what we've just kind of classified as selection bias within the included studies. So to kind of give you a peek behind the curtain, if I have someone that comes into, so right now I'm running a study where folks are doing a ton of calf raises for a very long time, and they're training their calves very, very hard. If I have someone that comes and visits the lab because they're interested in participating in my study, and they're like, yeah, man, I like tweaked my Achilles 2 years ago playing basketball, it's still kind of iffy. I'm going to be like, yeah, this study isn't for you because you're going to be training your calves very hard. This isn't going to work out, right? So that's an example of selection bias that is just kind of baked into research in general. So in the case of a volume study, if you're doing a quote unquote extreme volume study, someone comes into the lab, they're very out of shape, or they just don't have a ton of training kind of skill, or maybe you're just kind of worried about their ability to actually complete the protocol for whatever reason. That might be a reason either the participant themselves doesn't say yes to or consent to starting the study, or the researchers are just like, hey, we'll be in touch for subsequent studies, right? Maybe there was a higher degree of dropouts for those higher volume conditions. And hey, maybe the 10 and a half week average duration of the studies doesn't really apply to longer timescales because, if there's one thing I've learned about like powerlifting and just coaching in general, is that what someone can sustain in the short term might not be what they can sustain and benefit from in the long term. We've had folks do very, very hard studies. And after they finish the study, they just take like a whole month or two off because they're spent, right? That's not baked into these studies, right? And that's not really the goal of research. The goal is to say, hey, we're doing an experiment of protocol A versus protocol B, and we're trying to control as many things as possible, see which one comes out on top. Again, that's a much different question from what is the best volume for, Joe Smith coming off the street, whether he wants to become a natural pro bodybuilder or if he just wants to be able to play with his kids for as long as possible, right? That's kind of the way that I think about it, is you have this selection bias. You kind of have, in some cases, extreme protocols to kind of test the extreme, because that gives researchers insights into some of these questions and some of these relationships.
Yeah, makes sense. So I guess then for this meta-regression, I mean, was it one like meta that you guys looked at, or was it multiple studies, multiple metas that you guys looked at? And I know there were some other interesting things too that you guys did in terms of like figuring out, hey, what is a set? What does that look like? And again, I guess just so we're on the same page here, we do want to. You guys looked at 4 different things, right? You looked at volume for strength and hypertrophy, and then you looked at frequency for strength and hypertrophy. And we'll obviously just take this mostly from a volume standpoint, but maybe we can kind of briefly hit on the frequency side of things for hypertrophy. Jake, I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah. So there was, Josh, do you remember the exact, it was like 135 studies or something like that were included in the, all the extraction. Obviously not everything applied to each outcome.
Yeah, so I think you're probably doubling it because of the outcomes. So there were 67 total studies. I think off the top of my head, either 66 or 67. So basically all of them had some sort of strength outcome. So therefore they were included in the strength analyses. And then about half of them, so 35 studies, had a hypertrophy outcome, and therefore were included in the hypertrophy analyses. So basically what you do in this case is you do searches, right, for keywords, volume, resistance training, sets, whatever, right? And then you look at the titles, you say, hey, what's likely to fit? That gets a bunch of things off the table. Then you look at the abstracts, you say, okay, what's probably going to fit? That gets a bunch off the table. And now I think, Jake, we probably had like 200 studies at that point, maybe 300, something like that. Yeah. And then you read the full text and you say, okay, does this meet our inclusion criteria? And those inclusion criteria are defined on the front end, right? So basically in this case, you can just think of it as, hey, we needed healthy participants. They couldn't have been elderly. They couldn't have had some sort of disease. And they had to do resistance training that was at least a month long and also just differed in our key variables of interest, right? So it needed to differ in volume and or frequency. Everything else had to be the same. So a lot of people might see the results of the volume meta-regression and be like, oh, does that apply? Like, obviously the high volume conditions were not training hard, right? It's impossible to do 20 sets to failure per week somehow, which I would kind of take issue with. But that would have been grounds to exclude the study, right? So it had to meet those exclusion criteria, or it had to meet the inclusion criteria to be included, right? And then Jake and I spent, I don't even want to think about how many hours extracting all the information from those studies, right? How many sets were done? What was the hypertrophy? What was the age of the participants? What was the rest periods? You can actually download that data set for yourself if you want. That's freely available. Sometimes that includes emailing back and forth with the authors, trying to figure out what the deal is and fill in missing things. And a key part that we did was we looked at different ways of quantifying set volume. And Jake, I can let you explain that because I think I just stole the mic from you. But
no, you're good.
That was kind of a key. That was kind of a key part of our analysis, was a few different ways of looking at volume itself.
For sure. And one other inclusion criteria. I know that you weren't giving a comprehensive list, but I think one of the important ones too to emphasize is that all the hypertrophy measures were direct, meaning no DEXA, no bod pod, no arm circumference. We didn't include any studies that had those, or we didn't include any outcomes that had that as the measurement technique. It was all ultrasound, MRI, CT scan, that kind of stuff, which obviously drastically limits the amount of data that we can have, but we believe it's a little bit more precise and we can draw stronger conclusions from it. Anyway, back to the volume stuff. So yeah, this was another one of those things, going back to what we talked about earlier about why did we want to do this analysis and why did we do it the way that we did? And part of it is, we have this question of like, okay, well, people talk about 10 to 20 sets per week, or they talk about this dose response or whatever. And it's like, well, a lot of these, you look at the previous meta-analyses, and maybe there's a study where they do bench press and they measure chest hypertrophy and they measure triceps hypertrophy. And in these analyses, they traditionally would count one set of bench press as one set of chest and one set of triceps. But, in the field, if you're out there training yourself, you're coaching, whatever, a lot of people have that thought of like, man, does that really count the same for both of those muscles? Like, does that really make sense? So that was part of what we wanted to do, is kind of try to get at that question a little bit. So we did that, right, where everything was kind of broken down into these three different things. So we had the total sets that were done for that muscle group. So I guess as an example, let's talk about maybe they're doing 3 sets of lat pull downs and 3 sets of curls, right? And the outcome was biceps hypertrophy. So in that sort of situation, the total sets that were done would be 6, right? Counting both exercises that do utilize the biceps, the outcome of interest, counting all of those in that case. We also did just direct sets, which in that example would be 3, right? So just 3 sets of curls. We didn't count the lat pull downs in that example. And then we did the fractional sets, which are counting indirect work as half of a set. So in that case, it'd be 4.5, right? The 3 direct curl sets, and then the 3 sets of pull downs counted as half, so 1.5 there, fractional total being 4.5. So that way we wound up with, we talked about the strength and the hypertrophy, right, for volume and for frequency. But now we also have 3 different volume quantification methods for each of those. So the number of outcomes climbs quite quickly, but we feel it was worth it, and we were able to not just look at those different ways of quantifying it, but we're able to compare which of those seems to explain the data that we have the best, which then allows us to say, like, hey, based on our analysis, it probably makes the most sense to count your sets in this way, which in our case, the fractional method did seem to be the best. Does that mean that you should absolutely count your lat pull downs as half a set of biceps? Not necessarily. It might be more like 0.3 or 0.7 or 0.26. We don't know the exact optimal number. We did run a rough estimation of what that might be, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's in the mountain of supplemental materials somewhere, I'm sure. But yeah, just that's sort of the reason why we wanted to do that. And I think it's even if it's not perfectly describing that an indirect set is 0.5 sets or whatever, the idea is the same, that maybe it's not quite the same as a direct set. We do want to account for it for sure, but we do want to keep in context that it's not hitting that muscle directly when we're trying to plan our total volume allocation.
Yeah. So, and I think this is important because, again, when people talk about how many sets per week, it's like, one of the things is like, okay, so what are you actually counting as a set, right? And that's, that's important to know, because that's obviously going to alter, what you count, like, what that number ends up being. Because if I'm not mistaken, there are, and this was probably part of, a lot of the work you guys had to do was, the studies probably count it differently in each one. So you guys kind of had to go through and figure that out. And same thing with like, Josh, I remember you and Zach talked about with the RAR stuff. It's like, it was kind of hard to quantify exactly like what that was, and you had to kind of go through and figure that out. But getting clear on what you guys actually count as a set is super important. As you said, Jake, it's like you don't know the exact number, but this is a way to kind of quantify that, so that way and you can give better recommendations here for that.
Yeah, you're spot on there. So in the title of Zach's meta-regressions on repetitions in reserve, exploratory is really highlighted. I can't remember the exact title off the top of my head, but that paper is very much exploratory, and Zach would be the first to tell you that, because to your point, Jeff, the repetitions in reserve were often estimated using other lines of research. So if I did a velocity-based training study where I had one group train with greater velocity loss throughout the set, so meaning they induced more fatigue throughout the set and therefore trained closer to failure, that's going to be an interesting data point or an informative data point for lower RARs or training closer to failure. Whereas if in that same study you had a lower velocity loss group, they're training further from failure, right? But often they don't actually report the RAR in, say, a velocity-based training study. So therefore, we said, hey, we just don't have a ton of research on various repetitions in reserve. So we're going to, be the first to say this is exploratory, but try to use some other velocity data to get our best estimate for the average RER that these groups trained at, and therefore get the best look possible from the data we do have to look at the nature of the dose response relationship. We had the luxury in the case of the volume research that it's a lot easier to quantify that, right? Typically, what the process looked like, there's a table in the study outlining the training program, or maybe it's just described in the text, and then we kind of had to, make sense of that and make sure we understood it properly, and again, follow up with the authors as needed, and then kind of tabulate it on our end based on the way that we wanted to analyze it, right? By saying, okay, what was a direct set for the biceps, which would basically just be bicep curls? What was an indirect set for the biceps, which would be, like Jake said, lat pull downs or rows? And then that gave us the data that we wanted. So again, we had some luxuries here that Zach didn't have for his RIR meta-regressions. But the positive here for us with the volume analysis is that it's a little bit less exploratory, right? We have pretty good confidence in both our independent variable, so the x-axis on those graphs, which is just the number of sets per week, and we also have the hypertrophy measures, which some people might dispute the efficacy of some, or I should say, the validity of something like ultrasound muscle thickness or MRI muscle volume. But that's often what's used in research studies.
Yeah. And just super quick, just to jump in, I think that's another point of why we've tried to be cautious with the results and takeaways here, is that somebody could very reasonably disagree with how we quantified some of those things, right? So for example, we picked, like I said, half a set as our indirect stuff. Somebody could argue a different number. Somebody could argue about the exercises that we did, right? Somebody could say, a deadlift is a good example, right? Is that an indirect set for the quads or is it not? I think you could make a case either way. And there's some examples, like that it just increases the potential for the results to be ever so slightly, it's probably not going to make a big difference, but ever so slightly different, that would be reasonable critiques, right? So, we always try to bear that in mind when talking about this kind of stuff. And I think it's very important for the listener to know how many subjective decisions go into an analysis like this. It's something I didn't know before I got here and we were doing all this stuff, that I see meta-analysis and I'm like, oh, that's the highest quality evidence. That's like as close to perfect as we can get, right? But there's so much stuff. It's those things we just talked about. We decide the inclusion criteria. We screen all the studies. Maybe we miss something, or maybe we, accidentally overlook something, or we include something that maybe shouldn't be included, or different people can make an argument that, hey, you should include this for this reason, or you should exclude this for that reason. There's so many judgment calls with how you actually run the statistical tests and which tests you choose. And there's so much stuff. So with all of these, and we always try to be extra cautious, I think, with our work and how we communicate it, just because there's so much of that stuff that increases the uncertainty around the results. And we just, not only is it like incorrect technically to look at our study and say like, okay, well, you will get more hypertrophy up to this many sets a week or whatever it is, right? And with X number, that it's potentially counterproductive for people, right? It can get people to, if they just don't have the lifestyle to sustain training like that, or what have you, right? It could potentially have some negative outcomes. So we always want to make sure that we're being aware of those things. And I think the listener being aware of that helps them understand better how to take, these studies that these science communicators and researchers talk about and apply them a little bit more appropriately to their own life or their own practice as a coach or whatever.
Yeah, well, and I think all this too, somebody hears this and like, well, what's the point of it? But it's like at the end of the day, it's helpful to move things forward. And again, it gives us an idea of what to do. Again, it's never going to be, it's funny, it's science, but it's never going to be an exact science, right? And any of it, if that's how you take it, then again, you may be missing out. But again, it's going to give us a better idea of what to do moving forward. And I'm sure for you guys, this also allowed, is going to also open up more questions for people to get better research in the future as well too, around volume, which is super helpful and important as well too. So cool. And I think again, the good thing about going over all that is hey, this stuff is helpful, but at the same time, you can't just take it as like, hey, this is exactly what to do, right? You have to understand, some of the potential limitations of any research, not just what you guys did. And you guys took a very, complex topic, and I think you made it as accessible as possible, which I think is great. So let's maybe go over the findings, especially around the volumes side of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can kick it off, and then Jake, you can clean up my mess. So so yeah, to kind of recap, right? The goal is to understand the nature of the dose response relationship. So at the risk of oversimplifying this, basically what you get is a data point for each group within the 35 included hypertrophy studies, right? Some of those studies had two groups, some had three. There might have even been one or two with four groups. But nonetheless, you kind of have an X value, so the number of sets for the muscle that was measured per week, and then you have how much hypertrophy did they experience. Now, unfortunately, you can't just take those X and Y values, chuck them into a Google Sheets graph, and draw a best fit line and say, yeah, that's the one, because there's other things that the level of hypertrophy depends on, right? Maybe at our university, Florida Atlantic University, maybe we just train people really soft, which I promise you isn't the case, but maybe we just don't see as much hypertrophy in our studies. Or maybe just because folks at Florida Atlantic University, our population that we study, is a little bit better trained than average in the research, and therefore we just see a little bit less absolute growth, right? Whereas maybe at Jeff, your university, in this hypothetical world, you do an amazing job of pushing the subjects, and maybe your population is a little bit less trained. So therefore, just the fact of the lab and the cohort, that influences the growth to some degree. So that leads us into a term called nesting, which basically accounts for a lot of these factors. Is it absolutely perfect and bulletproof? No, but it allows us to put all of those data points that I was mentioning into a model while accounting for all of those other factors the best we can, especially ones we can be confident in, like, hey, just the fact that this was done at a certain lab, or the fact that these were trained versus untrained participants, or the fact that this study was 20 weeks long and therefore we just expect more growth compared to another study that was 6 weeks long. So effectively what you get, and probably if anyone has seen the outcomes from the paper, they'll probably see that dose response graph, which basically just has a blue line that, honestly, when you look at it, it just kind of goes up. And that's what it looks like at first glance, is, wow, more volume really is better. And basically, before we get to that point, what we do on the back end is we test multiple model fits. Okay, so we look at a linear model where there's not as much flexibility in terms of kind of any inflection point, if you will, in the dose response curve, right? We look at some models such as a spline model, which would probably give us an inverted U if there was one, right? So there's a ton of different model types, and basically the computer is trying to come to the best solution to do two things. The first is to fit the data the best it can, which is obvious, but also to kind of balance that with simplicity, okay? Because if we were to fit the data perfectly, basically what you would get is this really squiggly line, basically accounting for all of that variance, which obviously isn't true. So it's kind of this balance between describing the data and simplicity. And the best fit result for the effects of volume on hypertrophy is what's called a square root model. Now, not all square root models are the same. It's basically mathematical constraints that the computer then uses to, again, describe the data. But nonetheless, basically what that gives you is what's called a graded dose response relationship, which means that, yes, we didn't find strong evidence for a clear point at which there is no more hypertrophy from additional sets, but there are quite notable diminishing returns. And what diminishing returns means is just that, hey, that first set you do, that response is going to be quite robust in terms of hypertrophy. That second set you do, that's also going to be quite robust, but less so. And on and on and on that goes, right? Kind of if I were to like interpret this and kind of the way that I think about it, some of those initial sets in a training week are going to be about 3 times as effective as really high volume sets. So kind of those first 5 sets are about 3 times as stimulative as really high volume sets once you get above, say, 30 sets per week. So again, it goes up, and I think a lot of people see the graph and they're like, oh, more volume is better, full stop, right? But then if you really think about it a little bit more, and especially use some of the supplementary materials provided both in the manuscript itself and in the actual supplementary materials website that is provided alongside the paper, I think you get a slightly different interpretation. And then you pair that with the fact that we don't have a ton of data above about 25 sets per week. And therefore, there's kind of these lighter bands around that main dose response relationship. There's these lighter blue bands that follow it. Those kind of widen as you get to higher volumes. So we can't say with a ton of certainty that that dose response relationship does continue to go up past, say, 25 or 30 sets per week. It's the best guess that kind of the computer comes up with based on the constraints of the model. But, and this is emphasized in the paper itself, as a scientist, I absolutely have to say, and I would also say this as a science communicator, that the data is absolutely still compatible with a plateau past, say, 25 to 30 sets per week. Again, the best guess of the computer is that it continues to go up, but that very well might be due to error or just a low number of studies at the moment. So again, yeah, pretty strong dose response relationship, as Jake and I alluded to in the front end, a little bit stronger than we anticipated. But man, those diminishing returns, they are notable, and they are worth really considering when you think about your time investment for training and also fitting this into a balanced program. And all of those other things we mentioned before, hell, the fact that these studies are 10 and a half weeks and are often, college students or recent grads, things like that. And then there's also the high degree of uncertainty at higher volumes. That's kind of the elevator pitch for, I guess, a skyscraper here as we go to the 100th floor of the outcomes for volume and hypertrophy.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, I think one of the really cool ideas that that you had, Josh, was to look at sort of these like tiers, right? Of, you mentioned those early sets, probably bigger bang for your buck compared to the later sets when you get to those really high volumes. But then that really leads to the question of like, well, how do I decide when to stop, right? Like if I have somewhat limited time, how do I kind of do this and get the best bang for my buck? So that idea was great. And I think, I pulled up the table here just so I can, not get the numbers too wrong, but it's basically, based on our analysis, roughly 4 sets a week was like getting you some sort of growth, right? You get up into that kind of 5 to 10 sets a week. Now it's, fractional sets, to be clear, right? That's like that next tier up of like, oh yeah, cool, noticeably more hypertrophy, right? And I think those tiers can help people to conceptualize in a, still, are these numbers absolutely perfect for everybody? No, but it's at least in a overarching sense, the more that you do, the less and less you're going to get in terms of the return, right? And it even gets to the point where, if we're in this tier of we're doing 20 to 30 sets a week, you need to do, based on our analysis, again, another 11 just to get any noticeable difference, right? So like it just gets hard. You're fighting, tooth and nail just to get anything additional with those super high volumes. So then where it circles back to all the stuff we've talked about, is that really worth it? Even though our analysis might suggest like, yeah, you are likely to get some additional benefit, probably not super worth it, at least for most people, right? And then you also consider we talked about the limitations of the included studies. A lot of these studies, they only did bicep curls and nothing else, right? We start factoring in whole body training programs, all the extra fatigue on that, So yeah, I wanted to at least bring up the tiers there. I think Josh did a really good job of summarizing the main ideas, but I think the tiers are a very nice supplement to that in terms of translating this into a way that can help people make some of those decisions, particularly when they have time constraints or total energy constraints or things like that.
Josh,
I'll just jump in really quick. So I want to make sure it's clear what those tiers are based on, because I think it's Jake did a good job outlining those tiers, but it's really tricky to say that like whether something is meaningful or someone that's listening to this podcast might have heard the term significant or statistically significant. That's a really tricky thing to do is to kind of make those judgment calls, right? And we even mentioned, or I mentioned on the front end of the podcast, like kind of making those categorical or binary decisions in research is, at least our line of thinking, is not the best way to go. Probably what's better is to think of it in terms of probabilities and contextualizing that within the general error we see in research. So at the risk of taking us down a little bit of a rabbit hole, I'll try to make this quick. We looked at a ton of non-training control groups from another meta-analysis by James Steele. Basically, a non-training control group allows us to understand the degree of error just from observing people over time. Okay. And since they're not training, it's not obviously we don't really expect much muscle growth. We don't really expect much atrophy. We kind of expect them to stay the same. So kind of the variance around zero gives us an idea of just the general error in research, right? That's one of the reasons that you might see a study that does show greater growth from lower volumes, even though from a meta-analysis, there does tend to be a dose-response relationship, right? There's error in research. So we also want to contextualize the results from meta-analysis within error. And kind of the typical error from those non-training control groups was about 2% of muscle size. So basically, the simplest way to think of this is any difference that's less than about 2% in terms of muscle size increases throughout a training study very well could be due to error. So that's what those tiers do, is we say, okay, at what point do you get another increment of 2%? So it's actually a pretty rudimentary way of making that table, but it does two things. It kind of shows, like Jake very well said, it kind of shows you the amount of sets you need to do to exceed what could just be error, right? And it also just kind of shows how that changes, right? Because those initial sets are quite robust, but then they get less and less robust as you go. And therefore, like, I don't think it's really up for us to decide which of those tiers that Jake is alluding to, where someone should fall, right? Because for someone that's trying to squeeze everything they can out of their hypertrophy training, they might want to hedge their bets towards higher and higher volumes because that is the way it leans, right? Again, there's a ton of limitations here, and there's plenty of reasons to do lower volumes, especially if it starts kind of working against you in terms of injuries, deloading more frequently, maybe even some feelings of burnout or worse sleep. But if those things are in check, maybe for some people, it does make sense to push things to a slightly higher volume. But for other people, it might not be worth it, right? So I think that's kind of the calculus for a coach or for a lifter is what are the values of this individual? What are some of the potential negative consequences of higher volumes for this individual? Because again, we don't really have strong evidence that there is a point where if I do more sets, my body's going to be like, no, fuck you. I'm going to start making worse and worse hypertrophy. I think probably what's more likely is in the context of a typical training program or a reasonable training program, what's going to limit you is your ability to tolerate that volume, to sustain that volume, to stay healthy, to stay engaged in your training, to ensure high effort throughout all of your training. And that's probably what's going to limit you, as opposed to saying there's this magical, mystical, inverted U, and we're trying to find the peak of that inverted U for Jeff, your biceps, your lateral delts, your front delts, your rear delts, your, I don't know, some weird quad muscle that they might add. And now they're saying that the quads are 5 muscles. I don't know. That's probably a little bit less likely based on our data. And it's probably going to be working backwards from what's reasonable, logistical, and again, keeping in mind that uncertainty that, hey, maybe that plateau does happen way earlier than our analysis shows. But again, that's not really up for us to decide.
Jake, did you have? I know you have to go soon, so I just want to make sure if there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
No, I think that was a really good explanation and a really good clarification on where those tiers can kind of come from, and even more nuance on, why to never take exact numbers from studies, right? It's all about the keeping all the context in mind, thinking more in terms of directionality, rough magnitude, probabilities, all that kind of stuff. But I do need to run. But Jeff, thank you so much for having us. This is Awesome. Always super fun to talk to you, dude. And Josh will take us home.
Yep. Josh, do you still have a little bit of
Okay.
time to chat for a little bit?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Jake, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
See
We'll see you,
Jake.
boys.
Bye. Yeah, no, Josh, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. Kind of what you said there. Really, again, kind of like, it seems like, again, it's very similar to the reps in reserve, where it's like, you guys weren't looking for that necessarily, like that perfect number of like, this is the exact set. It's just like, again, what's that kind of relationship, like you said. And here it sounds like, based on this, again, you can't keep going. There's going to be some diminishing returns, and really it just comes down to, is it worth it to keep doing that? And you just kind of have to think like, yeah, I mean, really, is it worth it or not? And that's essentially, and you haven't found that number yet of where exactly it's at. But again, it does seem there to be like, the more time you put into it, you're going to get less and less return on your investment. And is that worth it to you or not?
Yeah, exactly. And to be clear, there probably is a point of a physiological inverted U. There are some studies out there that show that very extreme, novel, damaging training. So, for example, taking a totally untrained person off the street and having them do dozens of maximal eccentric repetitions, which are very, very damaging. Like if I were to do that, like I've been training for 10 years, and if I were to do that protocol right now, I'd probably be sore for 10 to 14 days, let alone someone that's never trained before. In studies like that, actual atrophy has been documented. So there's kind of a proof of concept that, yes, there's absolutely a point where, sure, you get more and more growth. There's inevitably a plateau. We just don't really know where that is, on average at least. And then there probably is, and actually, I feel quite confident saying there is a point where you start to see worse gains and probably eventually even atrophy. But it just really hasn't happened, even in kind of these extreme volume studies. So therefore, I think a reasonable recommendation is that, yeah, more is probably going to be better, but that payoff is going to be smaller and smaller as you go. And there might not even be any payoff, but I think it's unlikely to, lead to worse gains. You might just kind of be doing extra volume and wasting your time. But some people might be willing to roll the dice there for a potential benefit, or potentially just kind of staying at the same spot. And then in my experience, and again, I think the research would support this, probably what's going to happen first is that you're like, dude, I'm so smoked from my upper body day yesterday that I have no energy for lower body today. So then it's kind of more of a logistical game from there, as opposed to, again, this mystical ideal volume for each individual, which honestly, that's where my head was at probably 3 years ago. And that's something I've just kind of completely shifted on.
Yeah, it's like kind of like you said, there's going to be other things that are going to get in the way before you can actually get to this magical point anyways, right?
Yeah. And just to put my cards on the table, man, like for me, that point is pretty low. I I get very, very sore from training for whatever reason. We've alluded to Zach a few times, who's my business partner and colleague from a research perspective as well. So, we talk a lot, share experiences, and we just notice amongst our client rosters, and then also between Zach and I, just completely opposite experiences. Like if I were to go train right now with Zach and we were to train lower body, do the exact same protocols, exact same volume, exact same RIR, I'd probably be, cooked for 3 times longer than Zach would. And as a result, that kind of just brings my volume down a little bit more compared to Zach. Now, honestly, if I could tolerate a little bit more, do I think I would benefit from it? Yeah, but I'm not going to benefit more from it if I can't really sustain it and I can't, stick with it and eventually start resenting training and just being hurt. I still have aches and pains that kind of linger from periods that I tried to go way too hard. And that was a negative consequence of volume, but that's not something that the studies are going to pick up on. So that's where the coach and the athlete has to kind of focus on those practical things, monitoring, using the coach experience of the athlete, kind of intuition to notice some of those warning signs, that sort of thing.
Well, and then too, again, I'm sure that, exercise selection, all these things are also going to play a role in it. I'm sure you guys kind of accounted for this in it, but again, you probably that's going to be something that's also going to kind of impact those numbers as well too. And it's hard to control for that in this type of analysis.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a few thoughts on that, and I'm comfortable kind of going here, given it's pretty deep in the podcast. And I think at this point we have pretty reasonable folks listening. I'm sure all of your listeners are reasonable, but you know how the internet goes
Yes.
sometimes. A very common just thing that people say about research is that participants don't train hard, or that, if a study says that training to failure occurred, that probably didn't happen. Maybe there was no music in the training environment, or maybe the participants were literally talking during their sets with small talk with the researchers. I just don't think that's the case. Maybe that's happened at times. And also, some of the original research I got involved in when I was at my previous university, Ohio State University, it was in clinical populations. So specifically folks with arthritis, looking at resistance training versus stretching and a walking program. And in that case, like, yeah, they're not training to failure. Yeah, they're not playing Lil Baby on the speakers. But again, these studies are on young, healthy people, and they're growing a lot. And at least in our lab and all the labs that I've spoken to, whether it's at conferences or online, the training environment is very difficult. And it's often reported that it's the most difficult training that they ever have done. And that's like, I just don't think that that's really a valid critique in my opinion. However, I do think it is absolutely a valid critique to say that in the real world, training efficiency could be a little bit better because you can individualize things. So what do I mean by that? We finished up a multi-year data collection recently on quad hypertrophy from leg press training. And the leg press we had worked fantastic for probably about 67% of the participants. So about 2/3 of the participants, like, yeah, it was a killer quad exercise for them. We spent like 15 minutes with each participant at the beginning of the study, trying to get, the best leverages for their quad, because that's the muscle that we're growing, or sorry, that we're measuring. So therefore we want it to grow as much as possible. But for some of the participants, man, if I was coaching them, I would just say, let's use a different leg press, or let's go do a Smith machine squat, or something else, right? But you can't do that in research. So I do think that is very possible that, hey, there are just constraints and a lack of individualization in these studies. And therefore, you might need to do more sets in order to get a given response. Whereas if you have Jeff coaching you, he can really dial in your exercise selection, help you out with execution as well, that sort of thing, right? And also, Jeff might give you some autonomy in your training program as well, get you involved in the program design process, something like that. You feel a little bit more motivated to train. Whereas in a research study, typically they're very committed, but maybe there is an element there of like, man, I've been doing this study that is kind of designed to answer a research question, not really like what I would do otherwise. And it's pretty cool for 4 weeks, but then by week 12, you're like, man, I'm going to give up my all for these researchers because I really like these guys, but I'm kind of ready to be done. These things are all valid critiques, and I'd be the first to say them. But again, I don't think that there's just this chronic issue of higher volume groups training further from failure or training with less effort. But I do think there are some other reasons to kind of come to a similar conclusion. And that's why Jake and I really emphasized, or at least speaking for myself here, and I think he would agree, like, I wouldn't really take the numbers too literally. Now, again, I know we need numbers because that's helpful, but the way that I view it, man, is that the sets are really just a way to quantify the general stimulus.
Yep.
Okay. So really what we're trying to look at, or at least the way that I think about it, is what is the dose response of additional stimulus, right? And an easy way to quantify that is number of sets. But another way to improve the stimulus is to individualize your exercise selection, or to really improve your training skill, to, maybe get a couple extra reps with some sort of psychological approach, right? Whatever the case may be. And to me, that would follow kind of a similar pattern in terms of the dose response relationship. Like, it's not just the set itself, it's additional stimulus, right? So some people might see our results and say, okay, more sets generally leads to more gains, again, with all the caveats we mentioned. Therefore, I'm going to really prioritize volume in my program. In a lot of ways, I almost think the opposite. I almost think that, hey, I want to maximize the stimulus for the units of effort that I'm giving into my program, and I'm going to start with very good exercise selection, very good execution, nailing my repetitions in reserve and ensuring I'm getting nice and close to failure. Um, I'm going to, maybe do some tests to make sure that those RARs that I'm calling are actually accurate. And that's going to probably be the quickest way to improve the stimulus and with the least downsides, right? And then from there, once that training quality is fantastic, then you can titrate the dosage based on those practical constraints we mentioned there. So again, like kind of in a lot of ways, I see the data. I'm like, man, I'm going to nail that stimulus. I'm going to do as many sets as I can do from a time perspective, from an enjoyment perspective, from a sustainability perspective. For me, for some muscles, that is like, 12 to 20. For some other muscles, it's like 6 or 7, and I'm cool with that. And I think it's quite productive. Um, and I think that's where someone that's level-headed with experience, that's how they're going to view the data. Whereas someone that's maybe a little bit more, quick to jump to conclusions, or maybe it's just
Biased.
confused, biased or confused because there's, so many different content creators out there saying these different things, volume versus intensity, whatever. That's not really how I see it. I see this is the general relationship we see, the general results we see from additional dosage, or sorry, from additional stimulus. And you probably want to maximize your stimulus. And there's a lot of ways to maximize your stimulus besides just doing more sets.
Yeah, no, again, I mean, this, as I've referenced the meta-regression on the RAR, I mean, that's really been, again, when I first read it, I was like, okay, like there's that perfect RAR. But again, just generally speaking, hey, we want to get closer to failure. And like, that's been super helpful to help get that stimulus down, right? And now it's the same thing here with this volume where it's like, again, the bulk of your gains are going to come from those initial sets. And if you're hitting that stimulus, it's like you're getting most of it. And then it just comes down to, again, do you want to continue to go further with it? And from a time standpoint and how much time you want to dedicate.
Yeah. And to use the RAR meta-regressions as kind of like the opposite example is like, just because the estimated hypertrophy from training to failure was greater than the estimated hypertrophy at 3 RAR doesn't mean you have to do every single set to failure, right? Same idea here. Just because the estimated hypertrophy at 30 plus sets was greater than the estimated hypertrophy at less than 10 sets, that doesn't mean you have to do 30 plus sets, because there are logistical reasons why you would train at 3 RAR for maybe some sets, maybe all sets. There are also logistical reasons why you would train with less than 30 sets. In fact, I think most people shouldn't train with more than 30 sets per week. That's a lot. And our goal with communicating this has just been to be as cautious as possible of like, okay, there's going to be people that throw this dose response relationship on social media and put an inflammatory title with it. We can we can debate the pros and cons of, various, kind of towing the line of clickbait. But even with things out there on both sides, right? On both the critical side of volume, or just put more simply, the low volume camp versus the high volume camp. My hope is that people will look into it a little bit deeper, maybe end up on our page, be like, oh, these are the guys that actually did the research, and they're being like quite cautious, and they're kind of trying to emphasize a different interpretation, or this balanced interpretation, and noting all the limitations. Oh, like we had someone comment on one of our podcasts recently where we discussed this podcast. They were like, my faith in evidence-based fitness is restored. And I'm like, that is exactly what we want. Is like, research is so helpful if you communicate it properly and you apply it properly, as opposed to kind of like weaponizing it almost, which unfortunately is kind of what happens at times, as opposed to, we've sent out invites to quote unquote low volume people to come on our podcast and just like, let's discuss why, maybe from a technical perspective, or whatever, maybe from a swelling perspective in terms of our measurements of muscle size, why other reasons to add uncertainty beyond what Jake and I kind of rambled on about. And that's why we're grateful for folks like you to have us on and hopefully convert a certain proportion of people to kind of this balanced perspective of research.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. Yeah. I guess too, this, kind of comes into everything too. The length obviously is a huge component of this as well too. Again, you guys are limited in terms of, like you said initially, how long the studies are. And again, this goes into the like what we talked about, like long term, like, okay, yeah, you can do these high volumes, but like long term, is that something that are you going to run into burnout or injury before you can even get there anyways, right? So again, this length is super important. So I know for you, we've talked to you about like volume cycling in the past. Does this kind of strengthen that thought behind volume cycling for you, or does it lessen it, or where are you at with that?
Oh man, I think this is one of the biggest remaining questions. If I had to nail down the two biggest remaining questions in my mind in terms of like this dose response relationship for hypertrophy, the first is what I mentioned before is how does the efficiency of the dosage, specifically thinking about really good execution of training and really good individualization of exercise selection, how does that influence the dose response relationship? But the second question is how does this affect kind of the natty limit, if you will, for each individual? Because one perspective on our data is that, okay, we see the best results from high volumes. Therefore, to reach my natty limit over, say, a 20-year training career, I need to spend a good amount of time with pretty high volumes. Another perspective is that, sure, over the next 3 months, I might see more muscle growth from doing higher volumes, but and therefore I might kind of reach my natty limit quicker. But if I just do low volumes or moderate volumes, I get to the same point because we all know that there's kind of like, even though it's an asymptote, right? The gains slow down, right? So maybe you just kind of get to a certain point as you approach your quote unquote natty limit. You just get there faster from higher volumes, and therefore it doesn't really matter unless you really care what you look like, 2 years into training versus 4 years into training. Like and the short answer, man, is I don't know. I I think sometimes people are more time constrained in terms of getting to their natty limit than they think. I think we've seen a lot of examples like that in kind of the natural community where people would probably continue to gain muscle, albeit very slowly, if they weren't, getting into kind of years of their life, maybe their 50s or 60s, maybe they would continue to improve their physique. So I tend to think that this, like thinking of it as like a natty limit, isn't all that productive because a lot of people do continue to grow, especially in natural bodybuilding. They continue to grow multiple decades into their training career. Um, but also, a lot of people get to really high levels with low volumes. So again, in terms of whether high volumes just get you to that kind of genetic limit or natty max quicker, or it's actually required to get to that natty limit, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you. I'm doing a study on volume cycling right now, and it's not a 20-year study like a training career. I would love for that to be the case, but it is a 20-week study, which is relatively long. And we're taking a bunch of time points of hypertrophy. And therefore, we can get some insights into, okay, yeah, maybe um, one group saw better growth than the other, but where did that growth occur? Where was kind of the most efficient gains, whether it was kind of this constant volume approach versus a cycled volume approach? So, um, yeah, I think things get really interesting when you think about it from a time period beyond 10 and a half weeks. And I think a totally reasonable person could come to the conclusion that, yeah, that's cool. Volume goes or hypertrophy goes up with additional volume, but I think I'm just going to end up in the same spot. So I'm going to keep doing my low volume. To that, I'd tip my cap and say, hey, I think that's a fair perspective.
Makes sense. You just don't really know, and it's like, do you end up getting there anyways by just keeping it a little bit more the same versus kind of going up and down with it over time?
Yeah. Eric Helms, we just recorded a podcast with him a couple days ago on our show, and that'll be out within probably by the time this episode is out. And he is how do I say this nicely? He's maybe in the later stages of his career. I think he has many
Yep.
years of training ahead of him, but I think he's early 40s if I'm not mistaken. So, he recently got his pro card, so he's still improving, but I think he's probably in the mindset of, and actually he said this directly on a show, or on our show, is that I want to be as competitive as possible in his next season, which I can't remember if he's planning to compete in 2025 or 2026. He's like, I care about what I look like and my improvements in a 1 to 2 year time period, not, because I want to improve my placing then, not necessarily what happens in 2030, right? So that's a case where, from speaking with Eric, he's pushing pretty high volumes to see what he can eke out. So that's an example of, you know, maybe there's something to be kind of a requirement there to do higher volumes. We can't say for sure, but that's an example of where maybe it doesn't get you to the same spot. Maybe you do have to kind of push those levels to eke things out because again, we are kind of time constrained in a way because we don't have, eventually time is going to catch up to all of us.
Yep, absolutely. Again, yeah, no, and again, like you said, it could be a case by case basis. Eric's situation for him, maybe it is, worth it. Hey, to really push those volumes and try more of a cycle approach versus just hey, getting there at 50 or 55 or whatever it may be. So, um, cool. I guess based off of all this, then what would you kind of like to see next? I know you guys are obviously doing the like kind of per volume session stuff, but where would you guys where would you like to see this kind of volume research go from here?
That's a good question. I I would love to just get more volume data because, even though volume has been pretty well researched, there's still, again, a lot of uncertainty in our models. So I'd love to just get more high quality studies. I sometimes fantasize about a world where we just kind of get all researchers, all muscle researchers together, and we decide one topic to study for the next 2 years, and we just answer that question the best we can, and then we move on to the next topic.
Periodizer research.
Hey, I like that. I like that a lot. That's not going to happen. But we are going to continue to get additional volume data, and don't count on this. But if time permits, we hope to be able to update our model as we go, so we can kind of get the most updated look as that comes out. So yeah, just more volume research would be nice. I would like to better understand the effects of volume cycling because I think that gives us some insight into that question of, hey, do you just end up at the same spot if you do have periods of lower volume, or are higher volumes actually required to kind of get to your peak abilities? Another thing I'm really interested in, just from a conceptual perspective, is that when someone thinks of a high volume program, they might think, oh, there's just no way I can recover from higher volumes. And if I can't recover from session to session for a given muscle, therefore I'm not going to benefit from the next session, which I think is quite reasonable, like a reasonable hypothesis, but I haven't really seen that play out in the research. That kind of there's this like fatigue boogeyman, and if you aren't super fresh coming into a session for a muscle, that you can't see productive growth from it. Again, that just doesn't play out because if that was the case, we would expect for there to probably be a quicker plateau in terms of the volume dose response relationship. We might not see as strong of effects for training to failure. We might see considerably worse hypertrophy for higher reps because higher reps generally lead to more fatigue. We might see worse muscle growth for longer muscle length training, right? So in other words, we kind of see the opposite. We kind of see that more fatiguing, harder training leads to more growth. So, but again, I'm still interested in this hypothesis that you should be at least recovered to some degree to benefit from a session. So a study that I've recently pitched to our lab, I have no idea if this is going to happen, but that is to do kind of test the extreme of that. So if I was in one group and Jeff, you were in another group, maybe I am in the fatigued group. So I train, say, my chest twice a week, and I train it on Monday and Tuesday. Whereas you're in the unfatigued group, and you do the exact same program, but you do it on Monday and Thursday. So you get you get all of your volume in a less fatigued state, whereas presumably at least half of my volume is in a fatigued state because I just trained it the day before. Does that actually lead to worse hypertrophy? That's kind of an example of how I think as a researcher these days is what are the concepts, what are the principles for training that have kind of a wide effect beyond just this, very narrow view of what's the number of sets per week? What's the principle here? What should I look out for as a coach or an athlete? Do I need to be really fatigued and fresh and hitting PRs every session, or is it okay to have some overlapping soreness? These are questions that I can give you best guesses on in terms of experience and tangential research, but getting more insight into kind of these more conceptual fundamental questions is what I'm really interested in going forward.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. I know you guys, I know you're, it seems like every time I talk to you, you're working on at least a couple different studies and whatnot. So I would imagine you're going to get there. So that's awesome, man. Keep doing your work. It's super helpful. And this stuff is great, man. It's like you said, helping people figure this out and, really answering the questions I feel like really matter instead of like, oh, this is the exact number of sets you should do. Right. And I think this is kind of how we want to think anyways, with all this. So, really appreciate it, man. Is there anything else that's coming out that you want to let the audience know about or anything like that?
I would just say that if you've made it this far, you're probably interested in some of the nitty-gritty stuff. And on our YouTube channel, we do have some long podcast episodes discussing some of the specific methodology behind the papers. And a lot of the things that Jake and I mentioned, we dive into in very great detail in those podcast episodes. And also, we're just really prioritizing our podcast from a content perspective. We've gotten the best feedback on that. And it's kind of, I think, the best medium for science communication.
It is,
so and also we've kind of upgraded our setup recently, so we can include some visuals. And so I would just push people in the direction of our YouTube channel, because that's where we're kind of focusing right now in terms of science communication. And if you're specifically related to this content, we have already published like 8 hours worth of content on this paper with more to come as well.
Yeah, I remember seeing the first episode you guys dropped. I was like, holy shit, all right. I think it was like 4 out, maybe something. It could have been a little bit longer.
5
than
hours,
that.
baby.
5. Yep.
5.
I think I almost got through almost all of it. But it's all super helpful. I mean, you guys dive into a ton there. And like you said, this is definitely a better platform for science communication rather than Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So,
but you got to play the game a little bit. So, we're kind of cutting up those longer episodes into like shorter YouTube videos, starting to get some even shorter stuff on Instagram. Cause I don't want it to come off as like, I think that people are being immoral if they put clickbait titles on Instagram, even using our research. I get it. Like you got to play the game. And I get it, and it's a tricky area to kind of navigate as a science communicator. Even if I think very reasonable people can be like, yeah, it's going to lead to some misinterpretations, but it's also going to get more people in the door, and they'll go down the rabbit hole and really understand the nuance, and it'll be a huge net positive. And to that, I tip my cap and I say, sounds good.
Yep. Got to walk the fine line with it. And again, make sure you're like you said, you got to kind of play the game a little bit too. So
yeah.
Cool, Josh. Well, appreciate your time, man. Look forward to, more stuff coming out from you, and then we'll obviously get you back on again in the future. I'm sure there'll be plenty of topics to chat about, but I think this was a great kind of summary of this and very practical for people. So again, appreciate your time, man, and we'll talk to you next time.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on, man. Appreciate it.